But the reality is, getting a conviction against Officer Wilson, assuming this case even makes it to the trial phase, would be an immense uphill battle for prosecutors. Joining me now to discuss this is Paul Butler, a professor at Georgetown University Law School and a former federal prosecutor. Professor Butler, as always, thanks so much for being here. Explain, from a legal standpoint, the many obstacles prosecutors are up against in a case like this.
The hardest thing would be that the defendant is a police officer. Often jurors are extremely sympathetic to police officers. They think even if he made a mistake, he's got the hardest job in the world. So they often want to cut police officers some slack.
We still have so many facts to learn about this case. We know that Officer Wilson suffered, at the very least, swelling to his face from the struggle that took place in the car. How do self-defense laws in cases like these factor in?
So what the prosecution has to prove is that Officer Wilson believed that his life was in danger and that that belief was reasonable. So it's not enough if Officer Wilson just on his own thought that. A reasonable person would also have to think, unless I shoot this guy, he's going to kill me.
And how does eyewitness testimony play into this? I ask particularly since we've heard varying accounts of what happened, although all the eyewitnesses from the neighborhood who have come forward to the media so far seem to have a fairly consistent story, but there may be many witnesses that we don't know about yet.
First of all, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. When we look at the false convictions that have later been overturned, including in death penalty cases, it's often because of eyewitness testimony that was just flat out wrong. The other thing is, it's not unusual when a case goes to trial that there are conflicting stories. 95% of cases plead. So when a case goes to trial, that means that each side has a version to tell. The jurors just have to look at these conflicting stories and decide which one they believe.
The racial makeup of the grand jury: 9 whites, 3 African Americans. Talk about how that might factor into the way an indictment will or will not be handed down against Officer Wilson.
Jake, I don't think the race or gender dynamics of the grand jury here are that big a deal. The grand jury, unlike a regular jury, doesn't have to reach a unanimous verdict. It's just a majority verdict, and then the standard is lower than at a trial. The standard for a grand jury is probable cause. That's like if the jurors think 51% it probably happened, then they're allowed to indict.
As a prosecutor, are there any hard and fast rules when it comes to whether whites or blacks or men or women, how they tend to see a situation like this when it's a white police officer and a young African-American man?
Well, we know from people's life experiences and from the polls that we're seeing about Ferguson that African-Americans and white people are looking at this case very differently. African-Americans often are much more suspicious of the police. They're less likely to believe the police, in part because they've had more negative experiences with the police. You know, often white folks, their experience with the police is, you know, they got the cat out of the tree. African Americans, they locked up my dad. So, yes, we would like to think that race doesn't matter, but even in cases like this, especially in cases like this, race matters.
Paul Butler from Georgetown.